Tonight, it's my special pleasure to introduce two of my colleagues. I'll introduce them in the order in which they are gender particular, and also the order in which they're going to do their presentation. Our first speaker is Karen Wraith. She is here at St. Pat's. She's in charge of the critical care unit and that bird that flies around and rescues people. And she told me that whatever I said about her, she is probably going to qualify it. So I suspect that I will not put myself in that kind of state. Karen is a dear person. She's sitting on our board, executive board for the Institute, and has been really instrumental in keeping the organization going and getting lots of good ideas. Besides which, she cooks well. She's a great gardener. She shovels sand all afternoon, and we can tell anyone else anything. Welcome, Karen. Our second speaker is someone that everybody here knows, John Stone, who was the sort of both the brains and the spirit that informed the beginning of the Institute. And this may very well be John's last little presentation before he whips off and does his PhD. Can I tell him this thing? Of course I'm going to, it's too late. And John has been accepted at Brown University to do his PhD in philosophy. He's taken a very different direction, not different, parallel direction in his career. Has been in the practice of cardiology, which he's going to have to set aside for a while while he does his new endeavor. And he's going to talk to us about the professional excellence as it impacts on and informs medicine. Enough of my time. Karen, you need to start.
Yeah, I think my biggest decision tonight was whether to wear my reading glasses or not. I'm going to try without, but if something sounds really funny, someone might want to tell me and I'll put them on. Thank you all for coming. It's I actually feel very honored and privileged to be asked to do this tonight. The preparation for this presentation wound up having a pretty profound effect on me. As Jan told you, I'm the manager of several nursing units here at the hospital. I'm sort of in charge of and have to evaluate anywhere between 120 and 150 people. And when I was thinking about excellence, it came to mind that excellence in our profession is really what we're looking for. But unfortunately, I think we often get stuck on the idea of perfection. And they're very different concepts. And this idea just came to me when I was shoveling sand this afternoon. So I haven't developed it very far, but they're really different ideas, really different concepts, and they have very different outcomes. I was at a seminar not very long ago, and someone said, making a mistake is just another way of doing something. I don't know if in medicine we allow that of ourselves or others very much. How I've organized this lecture, I'm going to give some credit to John Hay. Last fall, I was privileged to attend his lecture series on excellence. And one of the first things he did was to define excellence in a series of 3 elements or 3 components, and I found those a very good structure on which to build this. What John said, and I'm sorry, but I have to say I don't remember which ancient philosopher this came from, but he said that excellence had 3 elements. One was knowing what was the right or the beautiful. The second one is choosing to do that which is right, which requires moral will. And the third one was the ability to enact that which was right. I think we often have a very simplistic definition in our heads about excellence without giving thought to these three components. So I'm going to be talking about them tonight as it relates to the profession of nursing. The second thing I'd like to do is something that I think everyone who has gone before me has, and that's gone back to Webster and talked about definitions. And it seems to me we've all had different copies of Webster, because I don't think any one of us has come up with the same definition. But my Webster, anyway, in talking about professions, I'm talking about a profession, defines it as an occupation or a vocation requiring advanced training in a liberal art or science, which usually involves mental rather than manual work. The second place I went to looking at defining a profession was a book called The Culture of Professionalism by Bledstein, which is one of the core books that you were offered for this class. And it had actually chapters that were defining professionalism, but what I found useful was that it spoke of it as a middle-class phenomena, which defined a space or a unique quality of a subject or a command of the profundities of a discipline. And this command, this knowledge, allowed for the practitioners of that profession to reject traditional authority, and the ability to do this and the consent to do this from the clients required trust. In the earlier stages of this country's development, the granting of professional rights and privileges by the many or by society as a whole to the few in the professions was based, I believe, on fusion of two things. One was the command of a specific body of knowledge, with, secondly, the notion of excellence, which was often based on the assumption of membership in the profession as a calling. I think you can all relate that ministers, doctors, etc. It's often seen as a calling, something that you're called to do out of the ordinary. I think today it is significant that we talk about these two terms, profession and excellence, as separate entities rather than something that's fused. In many instances, granting the professional a certain level of privilege has increasingly come under fire as membership in the profession has been demonstrated to not guarantee excellence or control of practice within the profession. Certification or belonging to a profession, no longer to society as a whole, promises excellence, if indeed it ever did. But there was some assumption of excellence pivotal to granting of the trust that was required to give the members of profession the authority that they needed to carry out their work. I think discovering these feet of clay within professions has had a profound effect on our entire society. I'm not about to argue here whether professionals asked for these privileges or assume that they should have them, but they were indeed granted by society as a whole, perhaps just based on the fact that they needed this trust in the omniscience of professionals for their own well-being. And I believe that in a lot of instances, professionals were only too glad to accept this adulation once it was given. I think perhaps the disparity or the dichotomy between what being in a profession means and the notion of excellence is perhaps why we're having this series in the first place. I think the assumption that they're one and the same is long gone. Well, how do we apply all this to nursing? In your packet of readings that you had tonight, there's are some excerpts from the readings of Florence Nightingale. She was sort of the guru of nursing, for those of you who haven't heard of her. There's also a chapter in there from a book entitled From Novice to Expert by Patricia Benner. I have read this book several times, and I have been struck by the congruence of what Florence Nightingale wrote over 100 years prior to Benner writing this book. Both of them were advocates and scholars in the area of nursing. Florence Nightingale's work about over 100 years ago was brought about by her observation of the care, or the lack of the care, that was given to the sick and wounded, and her own clear vision of what was needed to bring excellence and order to the undertaking of caring for these victims. Florence, as you may know, was a great one for putting order to things. I don't think nurses have gotten over that since. She was much like the entrepreneurs of today, and developed the profession of nursing to meet this whole area of unmet needs, which she discovered or identified. If you're familiar at all with the progress and the development of medicine since those early days, I think it wouldn't be a surprise to you to understand how the control over these specific and unmet needs that were assigned by Florence Nightingale to a particular group of people called nurses, to whom she gave very specific standards of quality and measurements of the same. How the control of this profession was overtaken by other groups with vested interests in the area of patient care, like hospitals, administrators, government, and physicians. Nursing, I believe, is now struggling to regain its original vision and to define its own particular and specific space and to control its own practice. I'd like to ask the audience tonight, when you think of a nurse or when you think of nursing, how do you identify this group of people or their profession or what they do? What is nursing to you? Dan?
Well, I have a vision about nursing externally, and I think that not only will patients saved by nurses, but young doctors and youth lives were saved by nurses. So I have a very deep personal sense of the skill and the nurturance that everybody around me that nurses are able to do, and also the skill with which they're able to play all the professional edges, smooth them on, mesh people together. That's where I come from as a physician trainee, and that was really carried me all the way through. I have incredible respect for the ability of nurses to keep us all on an even keel. So that's my vision.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Well, I think that the nurses show the human side of the healthcare. I think that the physicians, whether it's true or not, typically represent the technician, the scientist, the lab person in the lab coat, and the nurses are the ones who represent the compassion, the caring, the understanding, that aspect of healthcare, whether they deserve it or not.
Yes, Linda?
Karen, to me, nursing has changed a lot. So nursing is a ever-changing profession. I, of course, wasn't with Florence Nightingale, but I started many, many years ago, and the compassion and all that that you spoke about is true. But we have moved closer to having more of that scientific foundation and trying to learn from the physician and other sources what goes into making a sick patient and what makes them get well. I think the public oftentimes expects to see the nurse as the person that comes to their bedside in a white uniform and maybe a cap, but we don't wear those caps very often anymore, and sometimes we don't even have white uniforms on any longer. I'm always impressed when I go and talk to patients, or I don't know if I'm impressed, but I'm somewhat amused, I guess, when I'm talking to patients about their care, and they think that they never had a nurse taking care of them all night long, and they did, but the nurse was a male nurse, but they thought that was the physician, and it might have been the nursing assistant that was in there that was the male. So there's all kinds of things that have changed, so I'll just add that.
Yes, Ira.
Traditional roles are obviously changing and alternatives being explored, but for me, the nurse has always been the one who sort of walks with the patient, if you will, moment to moment during the course of treatment or the course of an illness. I've often been just a little at least envious, if not sometimes more than a little envious of that role, in that just the way the system is set up and responsibilities meted out. My job, and I think my position, was sort of to conceptualize the case and the plan of care, and then walk away to the next bed or next person. Whereas the nurse was he or she who could and had to deliver that care and be with the patient to see its effect, see where we failed, share the pain and the joys, all of it.
Chris?
I think it was interesting when you asked the question, because I think of coming to work during the day, thinking of nurses in one context. Yet when you ask, what do you think of when you say nurse, I immediately have these images of, or just use the phrase, nursing back to health. And I think of a physician as coming in and making an intervention at a time of illness. And much as Ira said, that's the only time to see him. But nursing to me is bringing the person back to health, doing all those little things. It's nurturing. It's well, it's the way I was brought up, and most of us were brought up, I guess. I see the nurse as a female. I see the doctor as a male. I see my mother as a female, and my mother would nurture and nurse also. So it really is, it's more an image of health, or return to health. Whereas the doctor does not have that same connotation about it. It's that immediate dramatic intervention. It does something, but you don't know what.
Thanks you all, because you're making this very easy. You've already given about half of my lecture here tonight, and it's really feels good to me that these are the kinds of images that people have. I presented this talk to our nursing administration group just to kind of practice last week, and their response to this question was, "It's never what I thought it was going to be." It's always different, and it's always changing. Chris, what you said is interesting. I have a quote from Florence Nightingale where she says, "What is sickness? Sickness or disease is nature's way of getting rid of the effects of conditions which have interfered with health. It is nature's attempt to cure. Nurses have to help her. Diseases are, practically speaking, adjectives, not nouns. What is health? And health is not only to be well, but to be able to use well every power we have. What is nursing? Nursing is to put us in the best possible conditions for nature to restore or to preserve health." And I think that fits in pretty well with what you said. I have another quote from a magazine I'll be talking about in just a second, but it says, "The concept of the Nightingale conspiracy means a resurgence of the feminine principle in medicine. that gentle yet strong form of power which complements and tames aggression. It is about a gathering of force from within oneself rather than from outside. It is about nurturance and joining, yet also allows for the intelligent application of knowledge, both inner and learned. Nursing is the balancing force in the world of medicine, which is kind of what you were talking about, Jan. As proposed by Florence Nightingale, nursing was a unique blend of practice with philosophy, and this blend creates the energy that is the guiding force of the profession, much as I believe it is for other professions. However, as nursing came to be defined and controlled by other interest groups, it perhaps lost some of its credibility as a profession as defined by Webster. In many instances, it became mostly physical work, not mental, and its tasks were often mostly defined by physicians or hospital regulations. There was not much place for independent assessment and function. This handmaiden role was comfortable for many as it fit well with the traditional role that was accorded to women. Treated as such by other professionals and the public, I believe it led to a facelessness and a feeling within nursing that they were all the same, and that you could replace one with another. They were all doing the same work. As Linda said, today you see very few nurses wearing traditional uniforms. We have a dress code, but I have to tell you that if you come in my unit, sometimes you'll see people in green socks and red socks with Christmas trees on them, and they wear Birkenstocks, they wear scrubs, they wear colored clothes. You rarely see a hat. No, let's take that back. You never see a cap. Did you see? Probably at Nurse Day, right? It was a special occasion. There was a survey that was talked about in the Nursing Management magazine several months ago, and it kind of brings up something about this role of uniform. They asked a lot of people what their perception was of a nurse, and it was a person in a white uniform and faced with someone in colored clothes or street clothes and a lab jacket, or just street clothes. The role was not as well defined. And I think people often relate to a role, and uniforms help to define that role. Well, what is the role of nursing? What is the knowing that is unique and the greatest possible good in the practice of this profession? What is the knowing of the right or the beautiful? As Ira said, the first point that I had is its continuity of presence versus the episodic interaction that physicians and lab techs and X-ray techs have with patients. It's very, very personal, and it's very one-to-one, and it often goes on over a long period of time. Second, I see nurses often in the role of patient advocacy, which goes hand in hand with the third thing, and I think this is probably the most important, is that I see nursing as the place and the person where the patient and his life and his disease meet the healthcare system. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. The second point, or the second element in the development of excellence is the ability is the choosing to do what is right. As I've said before, and I'll probably say again before I'm through here, nursing is a profession in time of transition. I think it's highly significant at this time that there's this magazine that just came out called Revolution, the Journal of Nurse Empowerment. We're seeing very much today in our profession the desire of nurses to reclaim those things that belong to them, and it's a struggle. If you could see all these nurses have their mouths blotted out in this picture, and it says, "We've been quiet too long." Has some very interesting titles of articles in it. Sayah, the nurse as sex object on get well cards. Nurses of the revolution, AIDS in nursing. Setting up shop, why nurses do it. The politics of breast cancer. Thinking about thinking. Revolutionary times, revolutionary leaders. It's a very fascinating magazine. It's got some good articles in it. For a long time, I believed that rather than claiming what was uniquely nursing, nurses have assumed responsibility for things over which we have no control. One of the things I see most often is someone will come on the unit, for example, a physician, and be really angry that lab tests aren't back. Well, it's not the nurse's fault, but the nurse gets yelled at and tries to fix it with the lab. We never think of giving the doctor the phone number of the lab and having him call and check it out. When patients' meal trays aren't done right, we take the heat for it. We don't often put the two people who should speak together. And I believe that taking the responsibilities for the failures within the system has been very frustrating and very de-energizing for nurses. And I think it also fosters the continuance of the dependencies within the system that allow these failures of performance to continue. There is a new role for nursing. I don't know how many of you are aware of it. Our hospital here and several other hospitals in Montana were granted a very great privilege about a year and a half ago. We were the recipients of a Robert Wood Johnson Pew Charitable Trust grant for strengthening hospital nursing. This whole program came about because of the current and perceived future shortage of nursing, and it was aimed at identifying the unique role of nursing and finding ways to make its practice more effective. As it comes about in practice, it involves all of the disciplines, because as any one discipline or one part of a system changes, all the other parts of that system have to change also. And we have found that rather than changing nursing care, we're changing patient care. Again, I believe that nursing is in a unique place to do this because of its pivotal role between the patient and all elements of the system. And I believe that this is one of the greatest goods and the greatest challenges of nursing, especially at this time when our whole system is failing so magnificently. Relinquishing the caretaking for all hospital systems, I think, also talks to us that we must look at the necessity for abandoning some of the dependencies that we've created in patients. I find it really interesting that patients who can walk and talk and feed themselves and take baths at home walk through our door and have to be in a wheelchair and someone has to give them a bath. This sort of change in the patient's autonomy in physical things, I think, very quickly has become losses of autonomy in other very much more important functions like decision-making about their own health care. there's a really, one of the things that's coming about with our grant practice here as it develops is that we're developing case managers. This is a new role for nursing, and it puts a nurse in a role to see a patient before they come in the hospital, to know about them, to follow them wherever they are in the hospital, and to do some home follow-up. Very often when that patient comes back in the hospital, the same case manager will be managing their care. I think this goes a great way in getting rid of the facelessness that nursing is to many people. There's a similar thing going on in England right now. As you know, they have a somewhat majorly different healthcare system than ours, but they're coming up with something called the named nurse. And what that is that every patient that enters a healthcare system has their own nurse. And no matter where they are or what's going on with them, they always have access to this nurse. They have her card, they have her phone number, and she is a ongoing and continuous link for that patient with the healthcare system. I think takes away some of the depersonalization of healthcare, and also puts a lot of accountability on that nurse. The third element in excellence is the ability to enact what is right. You know, there's lots of different ways of doing things, and there's lots of different things that we can do. We're faced with choices all the time. I would ask the question, given all the things I've said before, do nurses have the power and the ability and perhaps the will to provide excellence? I just recently read a book by Stephen Covey that was called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And there was a graph in the beginning of the book that was very mind-catching as well as eye-catching, and it was 2 circles. And one smaller circle in the center was our circle of impact, and then the bigger one was our circle of concern. And basically what he was talking about is that all of us in our personal lives and our professional lives have things that we can definitely make a difference in. And then there's another big circle of things that have an impact on our lives, but we don't really have much ability to influence those. But the more time that we spent in this outer circle of concern, that circle gets bigger, and our ability to impact those things that we can gets smaller because we're spending all our time in that big circle. I would have to tell you that I have days in which I despair that there will ever be a positive answer to the question is, can nurses, will they have the will to do what is right? I also have days when I'm so energized and so challenged and so exhilarated by what I see around me and by what I see that people can accomplish, that I think nothing can stop us in doing this. The big and important word here, I think, is us. Nursing has for a long time torn itself apart, gone off in a lot of different directions, and I think that a common goal and a common practice and program by nurses is absolutely essential to develop nursing as a profession. Sometimes the question is nursing a profession? I think it is. I think it lost its way, but I think it's on its way to finding its way to being a profession again. Well, why do I think that? First, nursing, I think, is perhaps the only element within the healthcare system that is unblinded by technology. We can can see the patient and care for the patient regardless of what's gone on before or after. Secondly, I think nursing is the only element able to coordinate the effects of the system to produce an outcome of quality in the eyes of the patient. Third, there's been a recognition of nurses as independent contractors. Third-party reimbursement is now being given to independent nurse practice, and that is a really major change. Fourth, just because of the positive effects I've seen here on the changes in nursing practice and accountability that we've had as we've proceeded with the implementation of the grant process here. To quote Florence Nightingale, who sometimes sounds just a bit like St. Paul, look for the ideal, but put it into the actual, not by vague exhortations, but by striving to turn beliefs into energies that would work in all the details of health. Why do I think nurses can accomplish this? Well, again, in their pivotal position between the patient and the system, they are uniquely placed to see the outcome. There is real interaction and real satisfactions possible as nurses become accountable for what they really have the power to influence and control. The total healing or restoration to the best possible functioning is not the responsibility or the ability of any one group. It is an outcome that's greater than the sum of all the parts that go into it. Society, as well as the individual, must become able to integrate the page ripped out of their life caused by illness or injury into the everyday fabric of their life, helping persons on a very personal and individual level. To do this is, I believe, the unique knowledge, choice, and ability of nurses.
Let me tell you a little bit about the form and a little bit about the content of my presentation. The form is that it won't be much of a presentation. It's going to be a little bit more of an interactive relationship. And in that regard, if any of you didn't get this handout that was on the desk over there, please raise your hand. Maybe Dixie could bring you a copy. Everybody have one? Which the use of force is the title of the essay in the top? Okay. So the form of it is that we're going to try to go through about 3 pieces. First, a short essay called The Use of Force. Secondly, a poem. And thirdly, a few selections from Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And I will direct you through reading some selected parts of each one, and we'll have a few minutes of interaction about each one, and we'll move on to the next. Now, the content that I intend, at the minimum, is that these 2 issues come out. First, that we cannot escape an examination of character and professional excellence. And so I'll first bring that issue out. And then the second issue I want to bring out has to do with the first. That is to using the text to reflect on 1, 2, or 3 features of character that, in this case, physicians, but I will propose any professionals in general ought to be reflecting on, thinking about, practicing. And so that's the form and that's the content, and we'll come back to the form and content issue in a few minutes. Now, just a couple of things of preliminary remarks. I think we're going to get down to work together. As might be evident from those of you who read the piece that I provided on the history of the virtues, and where a little bit in there I talked about my own training. When I finished my, at least the main portion of my residency training after medical school, it seemed fairly clear at that time that the main components of being a good doctor were to work hard, to know what the science was and how to apply it. Well, as all of us would imagine, it has never been that simple since then. And I spent a lot of the last 10 years myself sort of asking, what is it really that we ought to be doing here? What is the nature of this work? How do we do it well? What kind of things do we draw on to accomplish it in an excellent fashion? And in fact, what does excellence mean? What is the nature of excellence as a position? And I've repeatedly found myself quite puzzled about all that. And not only that, of those things that I was able to figure out that were at least components of what it was to do the work well, I often found that it stretched me pretty good. And lots of times stretched me more than I could stretch. And so some of that's the background for what I want to talk about this evening, or that is interact with you about this evening. And in part we will talk a little bit about some of the virtues that I put up on those signs up on the wall over there. And since I probably may not get back, well, we'll get back to this in a little, but it's a very interesting phenomenon. If you look at the names of the first two character traits, or virtues, if you will, of physicians and other professionals listed there, are compassion and care, which I think anyone could argue, or anyone would have trouble finding anyone to disagree with them, that those are crucial components of being a good health care provider. It's hard to imagine how you could be a good health care provider without those two characteristics. The facts are, however, as is I think evident to most everyone but physicians and maybe many physician educators, that those have an extraordinarily minor place in the education of physicians over several decades now. Although clearly there's some movements to recognize that. So that's, I think, a really striking paradox to me. Extraordinarily so. And so that puzzles me. It ought to puzzle us, I think. So with that sort of background, I would want to direct your attention now to this first piece, which is called The Use of Force, and I would ask you to pick it up and read it along with me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read portions of it out loud. I'll give you a little bit of the background and then ask for some commentary. And we'll get through with this by about 8:30. We'll take a few minutes break, and maybe Karen and I can reassemble. And maybe that would be a good time to talk about nursing and nurse-to-physician interaction, since we'll both be up there at the same time. Now this is from a collection, as I think is on your piece, of short stories by William Carlos Williams, who was a physician who particularly had some extra pediatrics background, and he practiced in New Jersey in the first several decades of this century. He also was an extraordinarily prolific poet and writer who is increasingly being recognized as somebody who has had and is having a profound influence on all of us. And this is a brief example of his prose from this collection. And Williams practiced in an area in which there were a lot of Italian, Polish, Eastern European immigrants in this area of New Jersey. And they were sort of earthy people, and Williams' prose and I don't know much about his poetry, often has this sort of earthy, close to the bone quality, which puts you right in touch with him, or at least the position that he's portraying. So here he is. He's in a house call. A lot of his work was house calls. There were new patients to me. All I had was the name, Olson. Please come down as soon as you can. My daughter is very sick. So he talks about arriving and being met by the mother, who's a large, startled-looking woman. He sort of used words that lots of people don't use, it seems to me. Very clean and apologetic. Said, "Is this the doctor? Let me in." So then we come in and we find this child here dressed, sitting in her father's lap, and then he says, talks about everybody being nervous, and they weren't telling him why he was there, why he was invited. He was supposed to find out he was the doctor. Now, let's get to the description of the child. The child was fairly eating me up with her cold, steady eyes and no expression to her face whatever. She did not move and seemed inwardly quiet, an unusually attractive little thing, and as strong as a heifer in appearance. Williams, though, he's just a very passionate man, and he sort of reacts passionately with everything in his environment, certainly including the people in it. So he talks about her appearance and that she has blonde hair and so forth, how beautiful she looks. But then she's had this fever. She's had a fever for 3 days, began the father, and we don't know what it comes from. And they're concerned. And one of the reasons they're concerned is there's been a lot of sickness around, and in fact, it turns out they're in the midst of a diphtheria epidemic, and that's a bad deal. So then he says, as doctors do, I took a trial shot at it as a point of departure. Has she a sore throat? And they comment that she says no, and the mother asks the child, and the child doesn't blink, doesn't do anything. And then he asks, have you looked at her throat? And the mother says, yes, I tried, but I couldn't see. And of course, if they have diphtheria, it's identified by this very thick gray membrane that sort of forms in the back of the pharynx. It's very dangerous, can cause obstruction of the airway and death in that fashion. So it's very important to find out, and it's diagnostic. So he's going to have to look in her throat to find out if this diphtheritic membrane is there. And the rest of the story, in fact, has to do with the development of his relationship with his child and the efforts to look into her throat. So, and I want you to think about this a little bit in a few minutes when we talk about the death of Ivan Illich and what some of his physicians' demeanor was, or were, demeanors were. So anyhow, as he says, well, I said, suppose we take a look at the throat first. And he says, I smiled in my best professional manner, and you can tell he's putting on this face and hoping it's going to work. Already, however, he's probably not too encouraged because the child is doing nothing, not even opening her mouth to speak. So he knows, perhaps, you get the sense that he may be in for trouble here. But he says, I said, come on, Matilda, open your mouth and let's look at your throat. Nothing doing. His prose is almost like poetry. Oh, come on, I coaxed, and so forth. And such a nice man, put in the mother. I'm skipping a little bit. Look how kind he is to you. Come on. Come on, do what he tells you. He won't hurt you. At that, I ground my teeth in disgust. If only they wouldn't use the word hurt, I might be able to get somewhere. So he's trying to orchestrate this thing, hoping he can look in his child's throat. But he knows from his experience, that a lot of pediatrics experience, it's going to be a problem. Then he moves his chair a little nearer suddenly, and then both her hands reach up and grab his glasses. So it's a big problem. So we go to the next page. They got embarrassed. He says, look, the nice man. He says, for heaven's sake, I broke in, don't call me a nice man to her. I'm here to look at her throat on the chance that she might have diphtheria and possibly die of it. But that's nothing to her. Look here, I said to the child, we're going to look at your throat. You're old enough to understand what I'm saying. Will you open it now by yourself, or shall we have to open it for you? So he's threatening, but you get the impression he's also getting caught up in this. Not a move. Even her expression hasn't changed. There's this, the child is immobile, everybody's getting revved up. The parents, the doctor's getting in, you sort of feel his gorge rising, and of course that's what he's trying to portray. There's sort of this cascade of events that suddenly, that the physician is caught up in, and the child is not caught up in it. That's the point. Okay, and then he says, not a move, even her expression hasn't changed. Her breaths, however, were coming faster and faster. Then the battle began, and of course that's a very important metaphor that he's using there. And so he's caught up, and it's now become warfare, and he's in the battle. I had to do it. I had to have a throat culture for her own protection, so forth. And he talks, what happens in the next several paragraphs as he talks about the importance of doing it, the parents having to hold the child down. Then he says also, midway, after all, I had already fallen in love with the savage brat. The parents were contemptible to me. In the ensuing struggle, they grew more and more abject, crushed, and exhausted, while she surely rose to magnificent heights of insane fury of effort, bred of her terror of me. So he's angry on one side, but he also admires her. Then he talks about her father being unable to hold her and him wanting to kill the father because he can't hold her, but so forth and so on. Then he tells her at the bottom of page 58 to put her in front of him and hold her wrists, but then the child screams, and basically the mother doesn't want her to continue. She can't stand it. Finally talks him into hold her. Then she manages to get a wooden tongue depressor between her teeth. She fought. She'd grown furious. But he says, but now I also had grown furious at a child. I tried to hold myself down, but I couldn't. I knew how to expose the throat for inspection, and I did my best. So then he gets her to, puts the wooden spatula in there, and he talks about her crunching it and reducing it to splinters. So then he has her get a spoon, and basically he eventually forces her mouth open with the spoon. Her mouth is already bleeding from the splinters. But he talks about how he's justified because he's seen a couple of children died in such cases. And at the bottom of the page 59, it says, I could have torn the child apart with my own fury and enjoyed it. It was a pleasure to attack her. My face was burning with it. The damned little brat must be protected against her own idiocy, one says to oneself at such times. Others must be protected against her. It is a social necessity, and all these things are true. But, there's a big but here. But a blind fury, a feeling of adult shame bred of a longing for muscular release are the operatives. One goes on to the end. Then basically what happens is he overpowers her, forces the spoon down her throat till she drags, finds the membrane, and now she truly was furious and has a big crying fit and so forth and so on. So here's this child who's quite ill, and this physician is a very experienced physician, we'll presume, and knew lots about this kind of problem, had seen children, and he really gets it into him. It's sort of this gradual evolution of this relationship all occurring in probably no more than 10 or 15 minutes. So he feels himself getting sort of sucked up into this vortex of the struggle, the battle. And at the same time, he's admiring her, but there's a piece of him that's doing that, but at the same time, he gets caught up in it and just somehow can't get out of whatever he gets caught up in. So I'm going to stop there and ask a couple of questions. That is, what did he get caught up with, and could he have prevented it? And if so, I guess 3 questions. If so, how? So, comments about that?
He couldn't spank the parents.
He what?
He couldn't spank the parents.
He couldn't spank the parents. I mean, he was angry at them because they wouldn't hold the child, so that he transferred his anger to the child. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Is that okay?
I don't know if it's ever really okay, but I don't know if it's ever something you have control over either.
Well, that's a good point. I think one of the issues that this, at least this story often brings up in discussions is it okay to be angry as a professional? And if it's okay to be angry, should you control it? And if you should, how do you do that?
I think as a professional, he's under a lot of time pressure throughout the whole day. He knows in the back of his mind that everything's piled up, one thing after another. And then he saw that child there, and he knew he wasn't going to get through with this, in any sort of dispatch. He says that in there. I want to get it over with so we get on to the next patient. So the anger's born of frustration that's right there all the time, everything happens, right? And it just happened to be a patient that caused the delay. I think that was a large part of his anger. It just intervened into the stressful situation of his own scheduled day. And that this child could do this to him caused a lot of anger. And this happens quite a bit, I imagine, with physicians and seeing patients. Got a lot of patients here. Here's one that's unnecessarily causing you trouble. No call for it. There's no reason for it.
You were behaving okay, you were a decent person?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Other comments on that, Sue?
You know, I don't know how it is with the bulk of you who deal with children, but it seems to me that the way the doctors treated me, and then the way they treated my children, and now I see them treating grandchildren, I think they have learned some skills in dealing with the parents that make this sort of story possibly not happen so often. I see children taken to dentists, for example, and the parents are rigorously excluded, and the doctors have those kids eating out of their hands. I think maybe medicine, at least, has learned a kind of not only compassion, but patience and perseverance, so that sometimes this kind of scenario doesn't happen. Now, maybe some of you who deal with parents and children say that doesn't, it still happens this way.
So what you're saying is that patience and perseverance are qualities that may prevent or at least work against anger. Is that right?
And learn skills, too. No, thank you.
Okay, other comments?
I've worked with children a lot over the years. I can't say that it should not have occurred, because I think it does occur, but maybe I don't think it needs to occur the way this story tells. I think the compassion and care has to begin right at the beginning, and I know that this position is very busy. All professionals are very busy, but things can occur much more quickly if you take a little bit of time. He really did not spend any time developing a relationship with that child. I mean, it may be very evident to him that that child's not going to be interested in any relationship by her mannerisms that she was portraying. But it still is good to take a few minutes to explain, first of all, to the parents what it is you're going to do and how you're going to accomplish it. And then to sit with the child and maybe just do some other things before this horrible thing of looking in the throat, because there's no child this age that likes that. And then if you can see that that's not going to do, then you just need to get on with it and do it quickly and over. And so there is all of the things that you talked about, and I really think that those skills have developed over the years. I don't see pediatricians have a whole lot of trouble doing that with children, because they take a